Few experiences are more difficult to explain than this one, because from the outside, almost nothing appears to be happening. You are still around people, still speaking, still answering questions, responding politely, participating when necessary. You can still sit at the same table, walk into the same room, meet the same friends, carry the same role in your family, your work, your daily life. And yet, somewhere beneath all of that, something has shifted. You begin to feel out of place, not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone watching you, but inwardly, the feeling is unmistakable. A conversation begins, and while everyone else seems to move through it naturally, something inside you hesitates. You can follow what is being said. You understand the topic. You know how to respond. But the whole exchange feels strangely thin, as if everyone is standing inside a surface-level reality that you can no longer fully return to. You may still speak. You may even sound completely normal. But part of you is elsewhere, not in the sense of distraction, but in the sense that you are seeing the interaction from a different depth. At first, this can seem like temporary fatigue. Maybe you assume you are just tired, overstimulated, less social than usual. You expect the feeling to pass. But then it returns, in different places, with different people, in conversations that used to feel easy, and that is when the experience becomes harder to dismiss. You begin noticing that what once felt natural now feels slightly foreign. Not wrong, not hostile, just misaligned. A friend tells a story, and everyone laughs in the right places, reacts in the expected rhythm, moves together through the moment. You do the same, but inwardly, you feel a subtle separation, not because you dislike them, not because you think you are above the conversation, but because what is moving everyone emotionally is no longer reaching you with the same force. You can see it. You can understand it. You just do not inhabit it in the same way. This often shows up most clearly in ordinary conversations. Talk about plans, people, frustrations, routines, things everyone says every day. In the past, these exchanges may have felt easy, even enjoyable. They carried a sense of shared reality. You participated without needing to think much about it. Now, you may notice yourself listening from a distance. You hear the words, but you also hear what is missing. You notice how much is implied, but never said. How quickly people move away from what is actually felt. How often conversation circles around things without ever really entering them. And this changes your experience. It becomes harder to feel fully included in moments where the contact remains on the surface. You may begin asking yourself questions you never used to ask. Why does this feel so empty? Why do I feel alone even while I am with people? Why do I understand what they are saying, but still feel separate from them? These questions can be unsettling because there is rarely a clear event to explain them. No conflict, no rupture, no obvious betrayal. In fact, the people around you may still care about you, enjoy your company, and assume nothing has changed at all. That is part of what makes the experience so strange. Externally, the connection remains. Internally, something has become less convincing. You may find this especially noticeable after spending time with people rather than during it. While the conversation is happening, you can still perform your part. You respond, smile, listen, contribute. But afterward, when you are alone again, something becomes clear. Instead of feeling nourished, you feel slightly more distant from yourself. Not always hurt, not always drained in a dramatic way, but unsettled, as if you were present outwardly without being fully met inwardly. That feeling begins to accumulate, and over time, it changes how you approach people. You may become quieter, not because you have nothing to say, but because much of what could be said does not feel worth saying in the same way. You may stop explaining certain things because you already sense that the language available in the moment will not reach the deeper layer of what you mean. You may answer more simply than you used to, withdraw from conversations sooner, lose interest and try to make yourself fully understandable. This can create another layer of pain because part of you still wants connection, still wants to feel recognized, still wants to meet others in a way that feels alive and mutual. But the more aware you become of the gap, the harder it becomes to pretend it is not there. This is where the feeling of being misunderstood begins to deepen. Not necessarily because people are actively misreading you, though that happens too, more because the version of you they respond to is often only a partial one. They hear your words, but not the depth behind them. They interpret your choices through older assumptions. They respond to who you used to be, or to who they expect you to be, while something inside you has already moved elsewhere. You may sense this in simple but painful moments. Someone describes you in a way that used to be true, but no longer feels accurate. Someone gives you advice that completely misses the actual nature of what you are experiencing. Someone tells you that you are overthinking, too sensitive, too distant, too serious, when what you are actually feeling is much harder to reduce than that. And because these moments are often small, they are easy to overlook individually, but together, they create a steady experience of not being fully met. You begin to realize that the loneliness you feel is not always about being physically alone. It is about not being joined in the place where you are actually living inwardly. That is a very particular form of loneliness, and it often appears most strongly after some degree of psychological growth. Because once your perception changes, once your inner life becomes more complex, once you begin to notice subtler dynamics in yourself and others, the old forms of connection may no longer satisfy you in the same way. This does not mean you become superior. It does not mean you outgrow everyone in some grand, dramatic sense. It means the level at which you experience life begins to shift, and not everyone around you is necessarily shifting in the same way, or at the same pace. That difference is enough to create distance. You may notice this when people talk about things that once consumed you, but now feel strangely repetitive. Old dramas, surface resentments, the same loops of blame, performance, comparison, self-justification. Earlier in life, you may have moved inside those same loops without much awareness. Now, even if you understand them, something in you can no longer fully live there, and that creates a problem that is difficult to solve socially. Because so much human connection is built not only on affection, but on shared patterns, shared assumptions, shared emotional rhythms, shared ways of interpreting reality. When those shared patterns begin to dissolve, connection can start to feel thinner, even when goodwill remains. This can make you question yourself in painful ways. Am I becoming distant? Am I disconnecting from people unnecessarily? Why do I feel less and less at home in places that used to feel familiar? These are not easy questions, because the answer is rarely simple. Sometimes there is avoidance involved. Sometimes there is growth. Sometimes both are mixed together. But one thing becomes increasingly clear. You are no longer able to remain unconsciously at ease in the same collective atmosphere. What used to feel natural now requires effort. What used to feel mutual now feels partial. What used to feel like belonging now sometimes feels like translation. And the more this happens, the more you begin to live with a quiet sense that something important has changed in your relationship to the world, not only to specific people, to reality as shared with others. You are still here, still part of ordinary life, still capable of connection, but inwardly, the experience has become more complicated. You are beginning to realize that feeling misunderstood is not always about words. Sometimes it is about being internally somewhere that the people around you do not yet recognize, and may never fully recognize, because they are still standing in a different relationship to themselves. That is the beginning of this particular pain. Not rejection, not abandonment, a subtler thing, the growing sense that even while surrounded by people, you are no longer fully living in the same world they are. What makes this experience so difficult to understand is that it does not begin as a social problem. It begins as an inner shift, and only later does that inner shift start changing the way you relate to other people. Carl Jung understood this process with unusual precision. He saw that as consciousness develops, the individual does not simply gain insight into life. The individual also begins to separate, psychologically, from the collective patterns that once provided a sense of belonging. This is one of the hidden costs of individuation. Not because individuation is antisocial, not because becoming more conscious means rejecting other people, but because the more clearly you see, the less completely you can participate in what is unconscious. That sentence carries the whole structure of the experience. Much of human connection happens through shared unconsciousness, through common assumptions, common emotional reactions, common interpretations of what matters, what is threatening, what is admirable, what is shameful, what deserves attention, what should be ignored. These things are rarely discussed explicitly. They are simply lived. They create a shared atmosphere, a sense that everyone is moving to the same reality in roughly the same way. As long as you are fully inside that atmosphere, belonging feels natural. You react when others react. You care about what they care about. You measure things through the same invisible standards. And because of that, connection often feels easy. Not necessarily deep, but easy. Jung called attention to this through ideas like participation mystique, the condition in which the individual is not yet fully differentiated from the surrounding psychological field. In such a state, a person is still largely identified with collective values, collective moods, collective assumptions. The boundary between one's own inner life and the atmosphere of the group is less clear. This is not a mistake in early development. It is a normal condition. It gives the ego structure. It allows adaptation. It creates a sense of orientation necessary for social life. But individuation gradually disrupts it. As you become more self-aware, you start to notice things that were once invisible to you. You begin to see patterns behind behavior, defense mechanisms behind certainty, projection behind judgment, compensation behind ambition, emotional contagion behind group moods. And once these things become visible, your participation changes. You are no longer fully carried by the same currents. A group becomes excited about something superficial, and part of you sees not only the surface enthusiasm, but the deeper structure underneath it. Someone becomes defensive in conversation, and you do not only hear the words. You feel the insecurity organizing them. People unite around irritation, gossip, collective complaint, or casual cruelty, and what once might have felt normal now appears as a shared unconscious pattern. This changes your experience immediately, because much of belonging depends on not seeing too much of the structure. The moment you begin to see it clearly, you are no longer immersed in it in the same way, and that is where the subtle loneliness begins. Jung would not describe this as mere alienation. Alienation is often sterile. It cuts off relationship. What he describes is differentiation. Differentiation means the ego is becoming more distinct from collective identification. You are no longer automatically fused with the dominant mood, the dominant assumptions, the dominant emotional grammar of the people around you. That is psychologically necessary, but it can feel socially painful. Because once differentiation begins, the old forms of connection stop working in the same way. You may still care about people. You may still love them. You may still understand them deeply. But the way you participate in their world is changing. And if they are not undergoing a similar shift, the gap can widen. This is why feeling misunderstood often intensifies after growth rather than before it. At earlier stages, you may have lacked language for your inner life, but you were still participating in enough shared structures that misunderstanding was not as psychologically sharp. Now, you may understand yourself better than ever, yet feel less understood by others, because the very process of becoming more conscious has changed what counts as real to you. You may have noticed this already. Things that once felt important in conversation no longer hold the same weight. The usual social exchanges feel repetitive, not because the people around you are unintelligent, but because you are hearing more than the content. You hear the defense beneath the confidence, the loneliness beneath the humor, the self-protection beneath the opinion, the habit beneath the personality. And when you hear all of that at once, it becomes difficult to return to a simple level of social participation. This does not make you superior. That is important. In fact, Jung warned constantly against inflation, the danger that greater awareness can turn into unconscious superiority. The person who sees more begins to identify with seeing, and in doing so becomes secretly cut off from others in a different way. So the challenge here is not to conclude that others are shallow and you are deep. That would only be another defense. The real issue is more difficult and more human than that. You are changing your relationship to the collective, and that means the kinds of connection that depended on unconscious sameness are no longer enough. Jung knew that much of social identity is built through adaptation to the collective. We become intelligible to others by emphasizing certain traits and suppressing others. We learn to speak in ways that preserve belonging. We internalize values, ambitions, fears, taboos, and emotional norms that make us socially legible. This process is what helps build the persona. The persona is not false in the simple sense. It is a necessary adaptation, but if it becomes too dominant, the individual starts living almost entirely through what is acceptable rather than what is true. Individuation forces tension into that arrangement. You begin to feel the difference between social legibility and inward truth, and once that difference is felt, ordinary interactions may begin to feel strained, because so many of them are still organized around persona-level exchange. People speak from their role. They listen from their expectation. They respond to your surface in terms of their own familiar categories. Meanwhile, something in you has moved beyond wanting to live only at that level. This is why even affectionate interactions can feel lonely. The problem is not that others dislike you. The problem is that the contact often stops at the level of adaptation. And when your inner life has become more psychologically real to you, adaptation no longer feels sufficient. Jung would say that the psyche now wants something more differentiated, more conscious, more inwardly honest. But such contact is rarer. It cannot be produced simply by familiarity, proximity, or social compatibility. It requires presence. It requires some willingness on both sides to step beyond collective habit. Not everyone can or wants to do that. That realization hurts, because it means that part of feeling misunderstood is structural. It is not always a result of one bad relationship or one insufficient conversation. Sometimes it comes from the fact that your inner development has changed the conditions under which you can feel genuinely met. Another important Jungian element here is projection. Much of ordinary relationship is mediated through projection. People do not only meet each other, they meet what they imagine, fear, idealize, and deny in one another. The more unconscious the relationship, the more projections organize it. This often creates emotional intensity, but not necessarily clarity. As your awareness grows, some of these projections begin to withdraw. You see other people less as carriers of your own unconscious material, and more as psychologically complex beings. That gives you more clarity, but it can also reduce the old feeling of immediate connection. Why? Because what felt like connection was often partly projection. When that begins to weaken, there could be a phase where nothing quite replaces it yet. You no longer feel fully at home in unconscious closeness. But conscious relationship is still rare. This is one of the loneliest phases of individuation. Jung did not romanticize it. He knew that becoming more inwardly distinct often creates a period of estrangement, not because one is meant to withdraw permanently, but because the old matrix of belonging is no longer enough, and the new form of belonging has not yet stabilized. That is why this experience often feels like standing between worlds. You can still enter the old one. You know how to speak its language. But something in you no longer lives there fully. And because of that, even ordinary moments of social life may carry a faint sense of unreality. The wrong response to this would be to conclude that the answer is total withdrawal. Jung never treated individuation as a rejection of the world. The task is not to sever relationship. The task is to become conscious within relationship. But that requires first understanding the nature of the distance you feel. You feel misunderstood not only because others fail to see you. You feel misunderstood because your psyche is no longer fully identified with the same psychological field that once made belonging easier. That is a much deeper explanation. It means the pain is real, but it is not meaningless. It is a cause of becoming more inwardly differentiated than the collective patterns around you can automatically accommodate. And once that is understood, the feeling itself begins to change, not disappear, but become interpretable. You are not simply broken in your connection to others. You are moving through a stage where old belonging is losing its authority, and more conscious form of relationship has not yet fully taken shape. That is a difficult place, but it is also an honest one. A different kind of task begins once you understand that this distance is not entirely accidental. At first, the instinct is usually one of two extremes. Either you try to force yourself back into the old ease, speaking more, adapting more, pretending the gap is not there, or you begin withdrawing slowly or abruptly, because it feels easier to protect your inner life than keep offering into spaces where it is rarely met. Both responses are understandable, and both can become traps. If you force yourself back into unconscious belonging, You betray something real that is already awakened in you. If you withdraw too completely, you may protect your depth at the cost of relationship itself. Jung's approach was never about choosing one of those extremes. It was about holding the tension long enough for a third way to emerge. That third way is more demanding than either adaptation or withdrawal. It is conscious relationship. And conscious relationship does not mean perfect intimacy, nor does it mean being fully understood by everyone. It means learning how to remain inwardly honest while still participating in human life. It means staying in contact without dissolving back into collective patterns, and without cutting yourself off simply because the contact is imperfect. This is not easy. In fact, this may be one of the most difficult forms of maturity, because it requires that you stop using misunderstanding as proof that relationship is impossible. And it also requires that you stop using belonging as proof that you must abandon your deeper awareness. Instead, you begin learning a quieter skill: how to stay present in interactions without expecting them to carry all the depth your inner life now holds. That adjustment changes everything. One of the reasons this phase hurts so much is that once your inner life becomes more psychologically real, you begin to crave a correspondingly real form of contact. Superficial exchanges become harder to tolerate, and ordinary social habits may start to feel performative or emotionally thin. In response, you may begin expecting more from every interaction than most interactions can actually provide, not because you are demanding in a shallow sense, but because your soul is hungry for recognition at a depth that ordinary social life rarely reaches. If that hunger is not understood, it can turn into chronic disappointment. You go into conversations already half aware that they will not fully meet you. You feel the partiality of the contact immediately, and the mind quietly concludes, "No one understands me, so there is no point." That conclusion feels convincing because it is built on something real, but it is still incomplete, because not every interaction is meant to carry the entire weight of your inner life. Some are light, some are practical, some are transitional, some are not deep, but still human. One of the dangers of individuation is that once you start seeing the inadequacy of unconscious connection, you may begin devaluing forms of relationship that are ordinary but not false. Jung would likely caution against this. The psyche seeks wholeness, not purity. Not every conversation must become a revelation. Not every person must be able to meet you in your deepest place in order for contact to still matter. This is where integration becomes more nuanced. You begin to distinguish between contact that is merely habitual and contact that is limited but still real. That distinction is important. A casual interaction may not touch your depths, but it may still carry warmth, goodwill, shared humanity, even quiet affection. If you dismiss all of that because it is not total understanding, you risk becoming cut off not only from the collective, but from life itself. So the question shifts. It is no longer only, why do I feel so misunderstood? It becomes, how do I remain truthful to what I now know without turning every imperfect interaction into proof of isolation? That is a harder, wiser question. You may begin to notice that what hurts you most is not always shallow contact itself. Sometimes it is your own reflex to disappear inside it, to split inwardly, to assume in advance that no one can follow you where you are, to retreat before the interaction has had a chance to become anything more than it first appears. This is understandable. If you have repeatedly felt unseen, withdrawal becomes protective, but it also prevents discovery, because conscious relationship often grows more slowly than projection-based connection. It may not arrive as instant recognition. It may have to be built through patience, selective honesty, careful attention to who can respond and who cannot. That requires discernment rather than total withdrawal. Discernment means you stop expecting everyone to understand you in the same way. You begin noticing where genuine openness exists, even if limited. You notice who can stay present when conversation deepens instead of immediately deflecting. Who becomes more real rather than more defended. Who listens without rushing to reduce what you are saying. Who may not fully understand your inner world, but respond with enough sincerity that contact still feels alive. These signals matter. They allow you to stop treating humanity as a single undifferentiated field that either understands you or does not. Instead, you begin to see gradations. Some people can meet you only at the level of routine. That may still have its place. Some can meet you in honesty, but not depth. Some can meet you in shared pain, but not in reflection. A few may be able to stand with you in ambiguity, complexity, and genuine inwardness. Part of maturity is learning not to demand from each person what belongs only to a few. This does not mean lowering your standards for intimacy. It means becoming realistic about where different forms of relationship can actually live. It also means allowing yourself to be known in more measured ways. One common response to feeling misunderstood is to over-explain, as if the right words could finally bridge the distance completely. Another is to stop explaining altogether. But there's a more integrated middle path. Speaking from what is true without trying to force total recognition. You say what matters. You leave space. You notice what returns. This is difficult because it requires a different kind of courage. Not the courage of pouring everything out, and not the safety of saying nothing, but the courage of offering something real, without controlling the outcome. Jung's psychology points in this direction repeatedly. Consciousness is not control. It is relationship. Relationship with yourself, with the unconscious, and with others. Once you understand that, your task is no longer to eliminate the pain of not always being fully understood. The task is to develop enough inner solidity that misunderstanding does not automatically sever your connection to yourself. That is where a deeper belonging begins. Not first with others, with yourself. You stop abandoning your own experience the moment it is not mirrored back accurately. You stop measuring the validity of what you feel solely through recognition from outside. You become capable of remaining inwardly connected even in imperfect company. This changes social life profoundly. You are less desperate for full mirroring, less crushed when an interaction remains partial, less tempted to disappear just because the room cannot hold your full depth. You begin to carry your own inner life more steadily. That does not make loneliness vanish, but it transforms it. Loneliness becomes less like exile and more like unshared depth. That is still painful, but it is not the same as believing you do not belong anywhere, because the truth is more complex. You may not belong unconsciously in the old way anymore, but you are learning how to belong consciously. That means finding or building spaces where more of you can exist without distortion. It means valuing fewer, truer conversations over constant social saturation. It means respecting your sensitivity without turning it into a reason to sever all ties. It means recognizing that some distance is a sign of growth, while some distance is a habit protection, and the two must not be confused. This is where the experience begins to soften, not because people suddenly understand everything, but because you stop expecting one impossible thing from all relationships at once. You no longer need every interaction to confirm your reality. You become more selective, more patient, more precise about where you place your vulnerability, your language, your energy. And in that selectivity, something stabilizes. You may still feel out of place in many ordinary conversations. You may still sense the gap between your inner world and the collective atmosphere around you, but you are no longer helpless inside that gap. You know what it is. You know why it exists. And slowly, you learn how to remain human within it. That is the real integration here. Not forcing yourself back into collective ease. Not glorifying your distance. But learning to stay in relationship without pretending you are still living at the same depth you once were. That is a different kind of belonging. Quieter, less automatic, more honest, and though it may take time, it is far more real than the old comfort that depended on not seeing what you now see. What makes this experience so painful is not simply that other people fail to understand you. It is that part of you still remembers what it felt like when belonging was easier, when conversations could remain at the surface without creating that subtle ache afterward. When you could move inside shared moods, shared concerns, shared assumptions, and not feel the internal split between participation and observation. That ease had a kind of innocence to it. And once it begins to disappear, you cannot fully recover it by pretending. This is why the phase feels so strange. You are not rejecting people. You are not necessarily becoming colder, more superior, or less human. You are becoming more conscious of the difference between contact and real meeting. And once you feel that difference deeply enough, ordinary social life no longer satisfies you in the same unconscious way. Carl Jung understood that individuation always involves a certain separation from the collective, not because the individual becomes better than others, but because the psyche begins to orient itself around something deeper than collective adaptation alone. That deeper orientation changes what feels real. It changes what you can tolerate. It changes the level at which connection becomes meaningful to you. And because of that, there is often a stretch of life where you feel suspended between two worlds. The old world of easy belonging no longer fully holds you. The new world of conscious relationship is not yet fully built. So you move through ordinary life carrying an extraordinary kind of distance, not visible to everyone, but very real to you. The temptation in this phase is to interpret that distance too quickly, to decide that no one will ever understand you, or to decide that you must go back to fitting in more completely. But both of those responses miss something important. This experience is not only social, it is developmental. It is showing you that your inner life has changed enough that the old forms of connection are no longer sufficient on their own. That is painful, but it is also meaningful, because it means you are no longer willing to live entirely at the level of adaptation. You are asking, whether consciously or not, for something truer, something that does not depend only on shared habits, shared scripts, or familiar collective rhythms. And that desire for truth will always make certain forms of belonging less comfortable. Before we close, take a moment and ask yourself something honestly. In the conversations where you feel most misunderstood, what is it that actually hurts? Is it that people disagree with you? Or is it that they never quite meet the deeper place from which you are speaking? That distinction matters, because once you can name what hurts, you can stop blaming yourself so quickly for feeling separate. If this resonates, share in the comments one kind of conversation that now leaves you feeling more alone than connected. Not complain about it, but to recognize it clearly. That recognition may help you see where your psyche is asking for a different quality of connection. And if you know someone who has been feeling strangely out of place in ordinary life, even around people they care about, share this video with them. It may help them understand that what feels like isolation is not always rejection. Sometimes it is the first sign that they are no longer living entirely inside the same world as everyone around them, and that, difficult as it is, can also be the beginning of a more conscious kind of belonging.